Hey guys, I've got something interesting for you today. I redesigned the breather system on my Harley Softail, and I had a look at the internet, and there are so many different ways of doing the breather system. And I think what I've come up with is very, very different to what the average guy does. It's a little bit outside the box, and if you want to see what I did, just flip to the end of the video. If you want to see how I got there, then watch the whole video. There's a couple of interesting points. Before we get to that, if you like my videos, please subscribe because it's a nice scorecard to see how many people watch my videos. But also, please leave a comment down at the bottom. The reason is I like to chat to you guys, and anyone that watches a video and doesn't agree with something, they have a look at the comments and they get other ideas. And then everyone benefits. So the comments are really, really important. Please leave a comment and let me know what you think of my idea. I'd love to know what you guys think. Okay, so why do we need a breather system on an engine? Before we get anywhere, let's just decide why we need a breather system on an engine. On a standard engine where the pistons are balanced, in other words, they're sitting at 180 degrees, the volume on the back side of the piston, on the other side, in the crank, is completely balanced. So as the one piston comes down, the volume goes to the other piston and so forth. Easy peasy. The minute that you have an engine that's not balanced, so a three-cylinder or a single-cylinder engine, then the volumes sort of need to grow and shrink depending on where the off-balance is. On a Harley engine, they share a common crank. So both conrods are on the same crank, right? So both pistons sort of go up at a similar time and they come down at a similar time. So you can imagine the volume inside the crankcase actually increases and decreases. Now you can't have that completely closed off because you're forcing the engine to work against itself, right? So you need a breather system, and all that the breather system does is it takes that volume behind the piston and it either vents it to atmosphere or it sucks in depending on where the stroke is. Okay, so venting a engine is not a new concept. It was a problem on the very first bikes, and modern engines still need to do it. So nothing new. How did the old guys deal with such a problem? So I have a 1958 Ariel 650 twin, and their pistons actually run like this. So they have no offset, and they need to deal with all the volume behind both pistons leaving and entering the crank. The older bikes solved this problem beautifully. All that they did is they took the venting line from the bottom of the crank and they just put it onto the back chain. Brilliant. It opens the atmosphere, the crank breathes nicely, and any oil carry over from the sort of mixture of the oil and the air inside the engine just goes onto the back chain. Bonus, you're oiling your back chain. Okay, so current engines, they don't do that. They take the breather system and they put it on the clean side of the air filter, and basically all that air goes back into the engine. There's a few reasons for doing this, but mostly it's an environmental issue, because they don't want the vented air going anywhere outside of atmosphere and going onto the road and so forth, which, look, I tend to agree with. I mean, if everyone just vented to the bottom of the bike or to the chain, you could have a problem with oil on the roads if everyone did it. There's a couple of issues with that. Any engine will have a certain amount of blow-by, especially on the older engines. On the newer engines, you won't get a lot of blow-by. So the combustion at the top of the piston might go past the rings and into the engine. So there's gases that have combusted, you don't have as much oxygen, and now you're feeding that air from the crank that has already combusted back into the engine. So there's not as much oxygen. The other issue is the air from the crank is warmer than the ambient air, and obviously warmer air is less dense than cold air. So again, you have less oxygen going to the engine, and let's be honest, it's a combustion process. You want as much oxygen as possible, right? Then the big issue, and this is what I found on my bike. At some point on an air-cooled engine, regardless of how good your oil separation system is or your pair valves are and all of that, you are going to get a bit of carryover, so a little bit of oil mist going into the back end or to the back of the air filter and causing issues. Now all that does is it carburizes your engine up, and also your combustion is not as good, so you lose a couple of horsepower. Now a lot of guys say that that's insignificant, and I would agree that a very new engine you probably won't have as much issues. I have a slightly older engine, and even though my oil separation system on the top of the heads is working exactly like it should, which is actually quite easy to test, but I'll get to that in a minute, I still had a noticeable decrease in horsepower. And the easiest way to pick it up is when you open the throttle, the bike sort of jumps a little bit. That's a telltale sign. And the other place where you pick it up is if you're in top gear, you're going up a hill and you sort of open the throttle and the bike just doesn't want to get going. That right there is a problem.
Not even drop it, yeah, just open around, get into that gap. Look, on the Blackbird I would have shot past both, but Blackbird doesn't sound like this!
Okay, so let's assume that the hot air going behind the air filter into the carburetor and into the engine is not a big deal. And let's just say that any combustible gases from the other side of the piston also not a big deal. It seems like the biggest issue with breather systems going to the back of the air filter, especially with Harleys, is the oil. They use a mist cooling system in the engine, so there is supposed to be a valve on the top of the engine that separates the oil from the air before it goes to the breather line. And there's a few ways to test that system to make sure that it's still working. The easiest practical test is to just warm up the engine, put a little bit of paper, or disconnect the breather, put a little bit of paper in front of the breather, and just check that there's no oil coming out. If you just sort of touch the throttle a little bit, you don't want to rev it too high. Sort of 3,000 RPMs will be a good indicator if you're getting blow-by with the oil, right? The other way is when you drain your oil from your normal drain line and you close your oil tank, it should be a very slow trickle, and if you let go of or you open your oil tank, it should all just flow out. Then you know that separation valve at the top of your engine is doing what it should. My bike passed those tests, so I had no oil carryover from the breather when I revved the bike, and when I drained the oil, no issues. So I decided to see how much oil I was actually getting off from the breather line. I disconnected the breather line from the back of the filter, and I designed 2 catch cans that were see-through. I made sure that the cross-sectional area was very, very similar to what the bike was, and in fact I added a little bit of a safety factor. And I found that I was only getting 1 or 2 mils off of these sort of catch cans, and there was no water in the breather line, which you do sometimes get when you start up the engine. We live in a very dry climate, so it's not that common to get water out of the breather line, but it is possible on a cold day when you start up. But as soon as the engine's warm, you won't get a lot of water. So anyway, I put these in the bike, and the only idea was to do a test to see how much oil I got out. They worked so well that I decided just to leave them in the filter. And for the whole of winter, they were in there, they were doing exactly what they were supposed to. The bike was reacting perfectly until I did a long trip on a very hot day. I was in the saddle for about 5 hours. The ambient temperature was 35 degrees C plus, and I did 5 hours down. I had a layover and the 5 hours back. When I hit the 5 hours on the way back, the bike started to complaining, and she was not happy. I could see that something was wrong. When I got home, I took the filter off, and I could see that filter was full of oil. So these 2 catch cans that worked perfectly over the whole winter all of a sudden stopped working. And I realized that any catch can will stop working, depending on the volume, of course. If the volume is too small, will stop working at some point. And I think the point is when the ambient temperature is much hotter than normal, and the viscosity of the oil makes the oil very fluid. The catch can will still take out the oil, will still separate any carryover, but if you sort of on the bike for hours and hours and hours, it'll just carry on pushing that oil, and then eventually it'll just go out the venting, and in my case ended up in the back of the filter. So I decided to completely remove that from the air filter and do a beautiful design. Well, in my opinion, I liked it. A completely different design. Okay, so before I tell you what I did on my bike, it's always a good idea to have a look on the internet and see what other guys have done, because some of the ideas are really, really good. I found one guy, insert name here, he just took a 2-stroke bottle, put it inside the air filter, put a clear line in, and put a few holes in the cap, and that was his catch can. I really think that's a good idea. I personally didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something slightly different. Then you get the guys that sell these smaller catch cans. But again, you're going to end up with the same problem that I had with my test system. They will work perfectly under normal operating conditions. But the minute that you do a very long drive, the temperature is really hot and the engine gets hot, and you drive for long periods, you are going to get blow-by. The other option is to put a breather filter. So you just take the 2 lines, you put a breather filter, and the guys put it underneath the carb, and it sort of hangs at the bottom of the carb. Not really what I would like to do. I don't like that look, but it'll work just fine. The problem is that filter will clog up at some point, and you're going to have to clean it every now and again. Otherwise, it just won't work. It'll start dripping on the engine, whatever. Some guys take the lines directly to ground. They take it through the front of the engine down the back. I didn't want any lines breaking my engine. I think my engine looks nice and clean as it is. I don't want lines sort of crossing the old push rods that the Harley still have and stuff like that. And it's just a personal preference. I didn't want to do that. I also didn't want a line going straight to ground and just leaving it. It would drip the odd oil and it won't be that bad, but again, from an environmental point of view, I just don't think that everyone should be doing that, because if everyone does it, there's going to be oil on the road. So again, I didn't want to do that. So my only real option was to put in a catch can. My design, I tried to keep as clean as possible, so there was no lines crossing the engine, and I wanted a really large catch can hidden somewhere on the bike that is completely invisible. I did something, and I was very chuffed with how it turned out. It looked like this. So in designing a system like this, you need to be careful, because if one part of the system isn't designed correctly, the whole system tends to fall apart. The size of the lines going to the catch can is actually very, very important. If you go too small, you've got too much resistance and the engine's going to labor, because it's not going to be able to get the volume that you need to fill up the back of the piston when it's moving up, and vice versa when it's moving down. I did the calcs, and you need a minimum of a 1/4 inch line from the breather to your T-piece. So each breather head side needs to be minimum of 1/4 inch to the T-piece. Then from the T-piece out, you need a minimum of 9mm ID, which works out roughly to 3/8 line. I ran the line underneath the tank to the center of the frame, and that center of the frame is where I actually hit the catch can. Now, most of that line is solid copper tubing. There's 2 reasons for that. The pressure drop in a solid line is far less than the normal fuel lines that you buy. Also, it won't get nipped as easy. So if you put a flexible line in between the tank and the frame and it nips it, then you completely close off the flow. Then the center tube where I hit the catch can, or I actually made the center tube the catch can, so there's quite a lot of volume there. The line extended about 200 mils down the center tube, so there's more than enough volume for the air to go all the way down to the bottom. The bottom of that center tube was closed off with a plastic plug, and the inside of the plug was recessed quite a bit. Now, I did that for 2 reasons. I didn't want the oil to sit on the inside of on the rim, on the inside of the tube, because that's a corrosion issue. And also, there might be some times where some water gets in there. So you want that to be in a nicely contained plastic holder. Then obviously it has a little drain plug at the bottom, which will be drained every now and again. And then the top of the tube is just closed off with some stainless steel pot scourers. And that has a two function. That's the outlet of the whole breathing system. So any very fine mist will be caught up and then just dripped down to the bottom. It also stops any dust and nonsense from getting in there. There is a problem with this system. And corrosion is the big problem. You don't want that tube to corrode. Because we live in such a dry environment, I'm not going to get a lot of vapor coming off the breather system in the engine. So vapor is not an issue. Unfortunately, engine oil does become slightly acidic. So every time I service the bike, I spray the inside of that tube out with fresh engine oil and a paraffin mixture, half-half. And that'll keep the corrosion at bay for the most part. And look, I mean, how long are you going to keep a bike? I'm expecting to keep the bike sort of 20 years. That's my goal anyway. And that tube's about 3 more thick, so it'll be fine. It'll last. If I was living at the coast and I know that a lot of water passes through the breather system, then I would be a little bit more careful, and the inside of that tube would be painted, and it's relatively easy just to paint it. I mean, I dip a rag in some paint and pull it through the tube with a piece of wire, and then you won't have any corrosion issues. I didn't bother doing that because I'm not going to have that issue. Anyway, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I went from the beginning to the end of how I got to my final solution. It has been working great, so I'm really chuffed with it. Please, if you want to try something like this, or let me know what you did, please leave a comment in the comment section. I will get back to you. I'm really interested to see what you guys do. Thanks for watching, guys.